The Dyatlov Pass, what they're still hiding. 9 experienced hikers, a mountain called Dead Mountain, a tent cut open from the inside with all their gear still in it, footprints in the snow leading away, barefoot in -30°C, and then just stopping. Bodies scattered across a kilometer of frozen slope in various states of undress, some with injuries that a forensic expert said required the force of a car crash and no external wounds to show for it. 2 missing their eyes, 1 missing her tongue. The Soviet government looked at all of that, closed the investigation after 3 months, and concluded the hikers had died from, and I am quoting the official report here, a compelling natural force. An unknown compelling force. That's it. Case closed, files classified, area restricted, nothing to see here. Go home, touch some grass, good night. They sealed those files for 30 years. So yeah, let's talk about Dyatlov Pass. January 1959, a group of 10 hikers set off from Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, in the Soviet Union, heading into the northern Ural Mountains for a Category 3 expedition. Category 3 was the most difficult classification in the Soviet hiking system at the time, reserved for experienced trekkers doing serious routes in serious conditions. Completing it would earn them the highest hiking certification available. These were not amateurs. The group was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Quiet, methodical, exactly the kind of person you want in charge when the weather turns. Alongside him were 8 fellow students and graduates, all experienced, all fit, plus 1 slightly unusual addition, Semyon Zolotarov, 38 years old, a WW2 veteran and ski instructor who had last minute joined the group after being pulled from a different expedition. He was noticeably older than everyone else, and nobody quite knew why he'd switched trips. We'll come back to him. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back a few days in due to a bad knee and joint pain. He was the only one who made it home alive. For the rest of his life, he said he never stopped wondering why it was him. The remaining 9 pressed on. Their diaries described a good trip. Camaraderie, jokes, songs around the fire, the usual grumbling about bad weather and heavy packs. The last entry was dated February 1st. That evening, caught in a snowstorm with limited visibility, they drifted off course and ended up on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, which in the local Mansi language translates roughly to Dead Mountain. Great sign. They made camp on the slope rather than descend in the dark and lose the altitude they'd climbed. They set up the tent, had some food, wrote a jokey internal newsletter they called the Evening Oterton, because yes, Soviet hikers had their own satirical camp newspaper, genuinely, and settled in for the night. Sometime in the early hours of February 2nd, something happened. When search parties finally reached the camp on February 26th, 3 weeks after the hikers had gone quiet, what they found made no sense. The tent was still standing. Inside, all their food, all their gear, all their shoes. Everything you would grab if you were leaving in a hurry was still sitting there, completely untouched. The tent itself had been cut open from the inside, not zipped, cut with a knife from within in multiple places, as though whoever was inside needed to get out right now, and the zip was not a fast enough option. Outside, 9 sets of footprints led away from the tent toward the tree line, 1.5 kilometers downhill. The footprints were calm, not running, just walking, quickly, in socks or bare feet in minus 30 degrees Celsius in the dark, away from all their gear toward the forest. The first bodies turned up at the edge of the tree line, under a large cedar tree, Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, in their underwear, barefoot, the remains of a small fire nearby. Branches on the tree were snapped up to 5 meters high. Someone had climbed it, apparently to look back at the tent. Both men had burned hands, consistent with trying to keep a fire alive without gloves. Cause of death? Hypothermia. Between the cedar and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodan, spaced out across the slope. Their positions suggested they had died trying to walk back to the tent. Slobodan had a fractured skull, not severe enough to kill him on its own, but there it was. All 3 hypothermia. That was 5. The remaining 4 weren't found until May, when the snow melted enough to reveal a ravine deeper in the woods. And this is where the medical examiner's report stops making sense. Thibaut Brignoles had a skull fracture so catastrophic there was bone matter inside his brain. Dubinina and Zolotarov both had massive chest fractures, multiple broken ribs on both sides. The forensic examiner wrote that the force required to produce those injuries was comparable to a high-speed car crash, and yet no external wounds to show for it. 2 missing their eyes, 1 missing her tongue. The forensic report attributed the soft tissue loss to decomposition in the running stream where the bodies were found. A lot of people have found that explanation convenient. And then, somewhat casually mentioned, buried in the investigation documents, several items of clothing from the group tested positive for radioactive contamination, specifically from Krivonishenko and Zolotarov. The Soviet government closed the investigation in May 1959. Compelling natural force. Files classified. Goodbye. Now here's where it gets interesting, because 2 members of this group deserve a closer look. The first is Yuri Krivonishenko, one of the dead men found under the cedar in his underwear. Krivonishenko was a nuclear engineer. 2 years before the Dyatlov incident, he had been involved in the cleanup of the Kishtim disaster, a catastrophic nuclear accident at the Mayak nuclear facility that the Soviet government suppressed so completely that most of the world didn't find out about it until decades later. Kishtim released radioactive contamination across hundreds of kilometers. Krivonishenko was one of the people sent in to deal with it, which would explain trace radiation on his personal clothing. It does not explain why that radiation was on the clothing of other members of the group. The second is Zolotarov, the 37-year-old WW2 veteran who joined at the last minute. There are researchers who have noted, carefully and with evidence, that Zolotarov fits the profile of a KGB informant very well. He had a history of joining hiking groups he hadn't originally been assigned to, switching between expeditions at the last moment. The theory, and let's be clear, this is a theory, not a confirmed fact, is that Zolotarov and Krivonishenko had been tasked by the KGB to make contact with CIA operatives in the Urals, using the hiker group as cover. The handoff, fake radioactive materials disguised as genuine nuclear secrets. The problem, the CIA apparently figured it out. That would explain the radiation. It would explain why a 38-year-old WW2 veteran was hanging around with 20-something students. It would explain why the investigation was shut down by direct orders from high-ranking regional officials before it had found anything. Ordered. By whom? He didn't say. Russia reopened the Dyatlov Pass in 2019, 60 years after the fact. The new official explanation, a delayed slab avalanche. The idea is that the hikers cut into the slope to pitch their tent, which destabilized the snowpack, and several hours later a slab broke loose, came down on the tent, partially crushed it, and sent the group scrambling out in the dark in a panic. The injuries on the final 4 bodies, the car crash level fractures, were consistent with being hit by a dense slab of compacted snow, not a blunt object. Scientists at ETH Zurich backed the physics. Avalanche experts said it was plausible. The Russian prosecutor announced it was solved. Almost nobody believes it. The main problems: there was no avalanche debris found at the scene by the initial search party. The slope the tent was on was not steep enough for a traditional avalanche by most expert assessments. The footprints leading away from the tent, 9 sets, calm, walking pace in a single direction, are not consistent with people who had just